Imagine this. You're working on a routine construction project, your mind preoccupied with schedules and deadlines. The sun is blazing over Albuquerque's arid West Mesa, and the ground is tough, unyielding. Then your shovel strikes something unusual, something that isn't dirt or rock. You dig a little deeper, and suddenly you're staring at what no one expects to find: human bones. This was the grim reality for a construction worker on that fateful day in February 2009. What began as just another job quickly turned into a horrifying crime scene, one that would unearth secrets the desert had kept buried for years. 11 women, mothers, daughters, sisters, all discarded in shallow graves like they were nothing. The scene was chaotic. Law enforcement arrived in droves, their faces as pale as the dusty sand they were now sifting through. They weren't just uncovering remains, they were uncovering a story. A story of lives lost, a killer who vanished without a trace, and a city haunted by the question, who did this? But as the investigators stood over the graves, one thing became chillingly clear: the West Mesa wasn't just a burial site. It was a message left by someone who had gotten away with murder for years. So, who could commit such calculated, cold-blooded acts? And why did they stop? Was it death? Prison? Or was this killer still out there, waiting for their next opportunity? The answers were buried with the victims, or so it seemed. As we peel back the layers of this haunting mystery, you might just find the clues that could solve it. Are you ready to investigate? Let's dig in. The West Mesa, a vast, windswept expanse of desolation, where the land stretches endlessly and the horizon blurs into the sky. It's a place where silence reigns, broken only by the whisper of the wind or the distant cry of a coyote. To the untrained eye, it seems empty, almost forgotten. But the truth? The West Mesa wasn't just a barren desert, it was the perfect hiding place. For years, the killer used this isolation to their advantage, turning the sandy expanse into a burial ground. The remoteness of the location provided a grim sort of security. No streetlights, no passersby, no one to hear a scream. Whoever was responsible knew this place well, knew it would keep their secret safe for years until fate intervened. When investigators arrived, they faced a daunting task. The West Mesa isn't just big, it's overwhelming. Stretching for miles, the unforgiving desert holds its secrets tightly, offering little in the way of clues. Shifting sands and exposure to the elements had erased any clear evidence, leaving only skeletal remains. But even in this emptiness, the ground told a story. The arrangement of the graves wasn't random. Each burial was deliberate, precise, as if the killer had marked the desert as their own personal canvas. This wasn't sloppy or impulsive, this was methodical. It suggested planning, patience, and above all, an unsettling familiarity with the area. Why the West Mesa? Was it chosen for its remoteness, or was there a deeper connection? Did the killer live nearby, or had they scouted this location with purpose? The answers were as elusive as the desert wind. As law enforcement combed the area, they faced more than just the challenges of the terrain. They faced time years of erosion, years of lost evidence. The desert may be quiet, but it's not forgiving. Clues vanish quickly in a place like this, and the killer likely knew that. But every secret buried in the West Mesa begged a question. And for investigators, the hardest question was this: how many more secrets lay undiscovered, waiting beneath the sand? 11 women, each with a name, a story, and a life they once lived. But for years, their stories were overshadowed by the grim circumstances of their deaths. To the world, they were victims of the West Mesa Murders, but before that, they were daughters, mothers, friends. They loved, laughed, and dreamed like anyone else. One of them was Michelle Valdez, a 22-year-old woman with a warm smile and a soft spot for animals. Michelle was known for her bubbly personality and how she could brighten a room with her presence. But like so many others, she struggled with the heavy weight of addiction, a shadow that followed her into dangerous circles. Michelle vanished in 2004, and for years her family searched for answers, clinging to hope, until the desert revealed her fate. Then there was Victoria Chavez, 36, a mother who fiercely loved her children despite facing her own battles. She had dreams of providing a better life for her family, but poverty and addiction tightened their grip. Victoria disappeared in 2003, leaving her children wondering why their mother never came home. Jamie Berla was just 15. She had her whole life ahead of her, a life tragically cut short. Jamie was last seen with her cousin Evelyn Salazar heading to a park in Albuquerque in 2004. Neither of them returned, and years later, both would be found among the West Mesa graves. These women weren't just names on a list, they were people who mattered. But in the chaos of their struggles, their lives became entwined with danger. Many of the victims had histories of addiction or involvement in sex work, putting them in vulnerable situations that predators could exploit. But here's the question that lingers. Was the killer targeting these women because of their struggles, knowing they were less likely to be missed by society? Or was there another reason these women, with their vastly different lives and stories, all ended up in the same place, sharing the same grim fate? Patterns began to emerge, but they only deepened the mystery. Most of the women vanished between 2003 and 2005, and many were last seen in Albuquerque's International District, a known hub for transient populations and high-risk activity. But these were more than just patterns. They were pieces of a puzzle that law enforcement and their families are still trying to solve. Because for each victim, there's an unanswered question. Who took their lives and why? Each name tied to the West Mesa murders carries a haunting story, one filled with dreams and struggles, with families left in agony. Their lives, though cut tragically short, deserve to be remembered not for how they ended, but for who they were. Monica Candelaria, a bright 21-year-old, was known for her infectious laugh and the way she could make anyone feel at ease. But beneath her cheerful exterior, Monica carried the weight of challenges she struggled to overcome. She disappeared in 23, leaving her family heartbroken and desperate for answers. Doreen Marquez, 27, was a doting mother who loved her children more than anything. She wanted a better life for them, but her personal battles often placed her on precarious paths. When she vanished in 23, her family's world crumbled, holding on to fading hope until her remains were identified years later. Virginia Cloven, 24, was a spirited young woman with dreams of building a stable future. Friends described her as kind and hopeful, even in tough times. She disappeared in 2004, one of many who simply seemed to vanish without a trace. Evelyn Salazar, 27, went missing alongside her cousin, Jamie Berla. Evelyn was the protective older cousin, always looking out for Jamie. Their families clung to memories of their laughter and closeness, never imagining that both would be found together in the desolate West Mesa. Then there was Selania Edwards, just 15 years old. Originally from Oklahoma, she had drifted far from home, eventually landing in Albuquerque. Selania's young life was marred by instability, and she became one of the youngest victims found on the West Mesa. What binds these women together is not just the tragic discovery of their remains. Many of them faced similar struggles: addiction, poverty, and working in industries that left them vulnerable to exploitation. They lived on society's margins, where their disappearances often went unnoticed for too long. But these commonalities only deepen the mystery. Did the killer prey on women who seemed invisible to the world, thinking no one would search for them? Or was there a darker, more calculated reason for why these women from different walks of life all ended up in the same place? For their families, the hardest part isn't just losing their loved ones, it's the unanswered questions. How could someone do this to their daughters, sisters, mothers? And how could the killer go unnoticed, hiding in plain sight? These women were more than victims. They were loved, they were wanted, and they mattered. As their stories unfold, one question grows louder: will justice ever find them? When investigators began digging through the dusty expanse of the West Mesa, they weren't just uncovering bones, they were uncovering a horrifying narrative. The condition of the remains told a chilling story of a killer who had operated undetected for years, their secrets buried under layers of sand and time. Forensic analysis revealed that the remains had been in the ground for several years, with many victims believed to have been killed between 2003 and 2005. The scorching desert heat and shifting sands had accelerated decomposition, leaving little more than skeletal remains. It was painstaking work, sifting through the dry soil for any fragment of evidence. But there was something deeply unsettling about what wasn't found. No clothing, no jewelry, no personal belongings. The site was eerily clean. Whoever buried these women had taken deliberate care to ensure that nothing would lead back to them. The absence of personal items raised a disturbing question. Had the killers stripped their victims of not just their lives, but their identities as well? Was this an attempt to erase them completely? The arrangement of the graves also provided clues. The bodies weren't scattered haphazardly, they were placed deliberately, as if the killer had a methodical process. Each grave was shallow, but precise, suggesting a level of planning that went beyond impulse. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated, cold, and controlled. And then there was the site itself, the barren West Mesa. Why here? Was it simply the isolation, or did the killer have a deeper connection to this desolate stretch of land? The site's remoteness meant it was unlikely anyone would stumble across it by accident, but that same remoteness would also make it a risky place for the killer to return to repeatedly. Law enforcement scoured the area for additional evidence. Could there be more graves yet to be discovered? Was this burial site chosen for convenience, or was it the killer's message to the world? The questions multiplied as the answers remained frustratingly elusive. The lack of physical evidence left investigators with more than just logistical challenges. It left them with a chilling realization. The person responsible for these murders wasn't just dangerous, they were meticulous. Every detail of the burial site suggested someone who understood how to cover their tracks and evade capture. But as methodical as the killer seemed, one truth became clear: no secret stays buried forever. The desert had given up its first dark secret, the remains of 11 women. Could it still hold the key to revealing the identity of the monster who put them there? When news of the West Mesa discovery broke, a wave of fear swept through Albuquerque. The revelation that a serial killer had been operating undetected for years wasn't just shocking, it was terrifying. For many residents, especially women living in circumstances similar to the victims, the barren stretch of desert became a symbol of vulnerability and dread. In the International District, a neighborhood where many of the victims were last seen, fear turned into unease and suspicion. Women who struggled with addiction or worked in vulnerable industries, sex work in particular, began to see their own lives reflected in the stories of the West Mesa victims. Could they have been next? Were they still in danger? The unanswered questions made everyday life feel like walking on a razor's edge. But fear wasn't the only emotion gripping the community. Anger simmered beneath the surface. Many felt abandoned by law enforcement, frustrated that the disappearances of these women hadn't been taken seriously until the bodies were discovered. Families of the victims had long pleaded for answers, only to face silence or indifference. For those on society's margins, the trust between vulnerable communities and law enforcement was already fragile. The West Mesa murders fractured it further. Women who lived precarious lives, those battling addiction, homelessness, or exploitation, felt unseen and unheard. The victims weren't just ignored in death, they were overlooked in life. The fear wasn't limited to vulnerable groups. Albuquerque as a whole felt the chilling reality that a killer could move unnoticed for so long. Mothers held their children closer. Residents locked their doors earlier. The desert, once seen as a quiet, almost peaceful backdrop to the city, now felt menacing. Yet, in the midst of fear, there were also calls for justice. Community leaders and activists rallied to bring attention to the case, urging law enforcement to do better, to care more, to act faster. Their message was clear: these women mattered, their lives mattered, and their deaths demanded answers. But as the days turned into months and the months into years, the community was left grappling with the same haunting questions. Was the killer still out there? And would they strike again? As investigators pieced together the grim puzzle of the West Mesa murders, one theory quickly rose to prominence: the work of a single, calculating serial killer. The methodical nature of the graves, the timeline of the victims' disappearances, and the similarities in their lives pointed to a chilling possibility: a predator who stalked Albuquerque's streets unnoticed for years. But what kind of person could commit such an atrocity? Law enforcement speculated that the killer likely knew the area well. The choice of the West Mesa as a burial site wasn't random. It was isolated, barren, and overlooked, ideal for concealing horrifying crimes. This level of planning suggested someone familiar with the environment and confident in their ability to avoid detection. The victims themselves provided further clues. Many were women in vulnerable situations, battling addiction, or engaged in sex work. This pattern raised disturbing questions. Was the killer specifically targeting these women because he believed their disappearances wouldn't draw much attention? Did he exploit their trust or desperation to lure them into danger? Theories about the killer's motives also emerged. Some speculated this was about power and control, a person who preyed on the marginalized to satisfy a twisted need for dominance. Others suggested the crimes could have been driven by hatred, targeting women from specific backgrounds for deeply personal reasons. But there was another question investigators couldn't ignore. Could this have been the work of more than one person? Some pointed to the organized nature of the burials, wondering if a network or group could have been involved. Was this a lone wolf, or was there a darker, more organized operation at play? The idea of a single perpetrator was compelling, but it left room for doubts. The West Mesa was vast, and burying so many victims over time without attracting attention seemed almost impossible for one person to manage. Could an accomplice have helped? Or was the killer hiding behind the facade of an ordinary life, blending into the very community they were terrorizing? What made this theory even more unnerving was the abrupt end to the murders. The last known victim disappeared in 2005, and no similar crimes were reported in the years that followed. Why did the killing stop? Did the killer die, move away, or end up in prison for another crime? Or could they still be living in Albuquerque, quietly carrying their secrets while the community remained on edge? As theories swirled, one thing was certain: whoever was behind these murders knew how to cover their tracks. And until that person or persons was found, the fear of their return loomed over Albuquerque like a shadow. In the early stages of the investigation, one name rose to the surface as a potential suspect: Lorenzo Montoya. To many in Albuquerque, Montoya's name was already synonymous with violence and danger. His history was littered with dark accusations, making him an immediate focus of law enforcement's suspicions. Montoya lived less than 5 miles from the West Mesa burial site. This close proximity raised a chilling possibility: could he have chosen this area for its convenience, a place he knew well enough to operate without fear of being caught? Investigators believed his familiarity with the landscape might have allowed him to carry out these crimes over several years. But it wasn't just his location that drew attention. Montoya had a documented history of violence against women, particularly those working in vulnerable industries like sex work. Reports of his predatory behavior had circulated for years, painting a picture of a man who knew how to exploit and manipulate. In several instances, women had accused him of luring them to isolated locations under false pretenses, only to subject them to terrifying abuse. Some managed to escape and tell their stories. Others were not as fortunate. In 2006, Montoya's violent tendencies took a fatal turn. A woman he had brought to his home ended up dead after a brutal struggle. She had been strangled, her life extinguished in a horrifying moment of violence. But this time, Montoya didn't walk away unscathed. The woman's boyfriend, who had been waiting for her nearby, burst into Montoya's home and shot him dead. In a matter of moments, the man who had terrorized so many met his own violent end. For investigators, Montoya's death left more questions than answers. His violent history, his proximity to the burial site, and his preference for targeting vulnerable women made him a compelling suspect. But there was no direct evidence tying him to the West Mesa murders. His death meant that he could neither confirm nor deny his involvement, and no new leads emerged to solidify his connection. This left a haunting possibility. If Montoya wasn't the West Mesa killer, then the person responsible was still out there. But if he was, had his death in 2006 been the reason, the killings abruptly stopped after 2005. Montoya's shadow loomed large over the investigation, but his guilt or innocence remained an open-ended question. Was he the predator who turned the West Mesa into his personal graveyard, or was he simply a violent man who shared too many similarities with the real killer? The answer remains shrouded in mystery, leaving the case as unsettling as ever. Lorenzo Montoya's violent history and proximity to the West Mesa made him an obvious suspect, but his death in 26 created an insurmountable obstacle for investigators. Without the ability to question him or connect him definitively to the murders, the case against Montoya remained frustratingly circumstantial, and as law enforcement dug deeper, the cracks in the theory widened. Despite his history, no physical evidence linked Montoya to the West Mesa burial site. Investigators combed through his home and property, searching for any clue, personal items belonging to the victims, traces of DNA, or even tools that could have been used to dig the graves. But they found nothing. The killer had left behind no smoking gun, and Montoya's connection to the crime remained speculative. Montoya's death also robbed investigators of any chance to understand his motives or confirm his involvement. Without his cooperation or even his denials, police were left grappling with an unsettling question. Was Lorenzo Montoya truly the West Mesa killer, or had they been barking up the wrong tree all along? As the months turned into years, other suspects came and went, but none fit as perfectly or as imperfectly as Montoya. Each lead seemed promising at first, only to fizzle out under scrutiny. Tips from the public, forensic tests, and witness statements all led to the same result: dead ends. This lack of progress didn't just stall the investigation, it eroded hope. For the families of the victims, each false lead was another cruel reminder that justice remained out of reach. For the Albuquerque community, it deepened the fear that the real killer might still be out there, living quietly, blending in, and perhaps waiting for the right moment to strike again. The case's frustrating open-endedness also raised doubts about the focus on Montoya. Had investigators poured too many resources into a dead suspect, while the real killer remained hidden in plain sight? Or was Montoya's death truly the reason the murders stopped, leaving a trail that had gone cold forever? As the investigation stalled, one thing became painfully clear. The West Mesa murders were no ordinary case. The killer's ability to evade capture wasn't just luck, it was precision. Whether Montoya was guilty or not, the person who buried those women had managed to outsmart law enforcement at every turn. The question now wasn't just about who committed the murders. It was also about whether justice could ever truly be served. Would the answers remain buried with the victims, or was there still hope of unearthing the truth? For now, disappointment hung heavy over the case, leaving a community desperate for closure and haunted by what might never be known. The West Mesa, a sprawling stretch of barren desert on the outskirts of Albuquerque, became the unmarked graveyard for 11 women. Its desolation tells part of the story, but the choice of this location raises deeper questions about the killer and their methods. Why here? And what does the location itself reveal about the person responsible? To the casual observer, the West Mesa seems empty, forgotten. No homes, no businesses, and no prying eyes. But for a killer, this desolation wasn't just convenient, it was strategic. The area's remoteness ensured privacy. At night, under the cover of darkness, the desert became a blank canvas for unspeakable acts. The risk of discovery was minimal. no one would hear a cry for help, and even the burial process could be carried out without interruption. But choosing such a specific location suggests more than convenience. It suggests knowledge. The killer likely had an intimate understanding of the area, its terrain, its isolation, and how little attention it attracted. Was this someone who lived nearby, someone who drove these roads often? Or had they scouted the site, deliberately searching for the perfect place to hide their crimes? The burial site itself offered additional clues. The graves were not haphazard. They were carefully spaced and deliberately placed, indicating the killer returned multiple times. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, it was calculated. Returning to the same spot repeatedly required confidence that the site wouldn't be discovered and that the killer wouldn't be caught. Then there's the question of Albuquerque's rapid expansion. At the time of the murders, the West Mesa was still undeveloped, a no man's land, but construction was creeping closer. Did the killer know that the site's days as a secluded burial ground were numbered? Had they stopped using it out of fear that it would eventually be uncovered? Another possibility is chilling to consider. Did the killer stop not because they wanted to, but because they had to? Perhaps they were no longer able to access the site, whether due to incarceration, relocation, or even death. The West Mesa itself holds answers that may never be fully understood. Its vastness provided the killer with anonymity, but it also held the evidence of their crimes for years. When the desert finally gave up its secrets, it left behind more questions than answers. Was this site chosen purely for its seclusion, or was it personal? And most haunting of all, could the killer still be familiar with this stretch of desert, driving past it even now, knowing the graves remain as silent witnesses to their acts? The location tells us one thing for certain. This killer was methodical, patient, and disturbingly familiar with how to use the land to their advantage. And while the West Mesa holds some answers, its silence may be the very thing that keeps the truth hidden forever. As investigators delved deeper into the West Mesa murders, a dark and disturbing possibility emerged: a connection to Albuquerque's underground sex trafficking industry. The lives of the victims, many of whom struggled with addiction and worked in vulnerable industries, intersected with dangerous networks where predators operated in the shadows. Albuquerque's international district was known for its transient population, high crime rates, and as a hub for illicit activities, including sex work and trafficking. Many of the women who became victims of the West Mesa killer were last seen in this area, often in circumstances that placed them at extreme risk. For some, the promise of quick cash or an escape from addiction lured them into the orbit of men who saw them as disposable. This connection raised troubling questions. Could the killer have been part of this underground network, exploiting women who were already vulnerable and then discarding them when they became inconvenient? Or was the killer someone who preyed on the fringes of this world, hunting for victims in places where desperation often made people invisible? The similarities between the victims' lives supported this theory. Many had histories of being arrested for sex work or drug-related charges, a common thread that tied them to environments rife with danger. In these circles, trust was a fragile commodity, and predators could easily pose as clients or even offer false promises of help to lure their victims. For investigators, the possibility of a connection to sex trafficking added another layer of complexity. If the killer was part of a larger network, they could have had access to women who were already isolated from their families and communities. In the grim world of trafficking, victims are often moved frequently, their connections to loved ones severed, making it even harder to trace their last known whereabouts. But could the trafficking industry itself be shielding the killer? It's a question that still lingers. If the murderer was connected to this network, their anonymity could have been protected by the same system that preyed on these women. Witnesses who might know something are often too afraid to come forward, fearing retaliation from powerful figures in these illegal operations. The shadow of trafficking not only clouds the investigation, but also underscores the tragedy of these women's lives. Many of them were caught in a cycle of exploitation and addiction, making them easy targets for someone who saw them as nothing more than an opportunity. And yet, the connection to sex trafficking raises another chilling question. Were the West Mesa murders the isolated actions of a single predator, or were they part of a much larger, more sinister operation? If trafficking played a role, the answers might be buried even deeper than the victims themselves. In exploring these networks, investigators hope to uncover not only the identity of the killer, but also the systems that allowed such horrors to persist. But as of today, the link remains speculative, another piece of a puzzle that refuses to come together. The timeline of the West Mesa murders is as chilling as it is perplexing. Forensic evidence revealed that the women were likely killed between 2003 and 2005, a span of just a few years. But then, as abruptly as the killing started, they stopped. No new victims were linked to the killer after 2005. Why? Piecing together, the timeline paints a grim picture of a predator who operated with methodical precision. Many of the women were last seen in Albuquerque's International District, often in similar circumstances, leaving their homes or known haunts, only to vanish without a trace. These disappearances were largely unnoticed at the time, as many of the victims lived transient lifestyles or were estranged from their families. For years, the killer moved through the city undetected and unchallenged, striking repeatedly. Then, without warning, the murders ceased. The abrupt halt raised a series of haunting questions. What changed in 2005? Did the killer die, get arrested for an unrelated crime, or move to a new hunting ground? Or had they simply decided to stop? One theory is that the killer's access to the burial site might have been compromised. By 2005, Albuquerque's rapid urban development was inching closer to the West Mesa. Construction projects and residential growth were making the area less isolated. Could the killer have feared discovery, abandoning the site as it became too risky to use? Another possibility is incarceration. Was the killer arrested for a different crime, serving time for offenses unrelated to the West Mesa murders? This scenario isn't uncommon. Many serial killers are initially caught for minor infractions before their true crimes come to light. Investigators combed through records of arrests during that time, searching for individuals who matched the profile of someone capable of such heinous acts. Some have suggested the killer might have died. Whether due to natural causes, an accident, or foul play, their death could explain why the murders stopped so suddenly. If this is the case, the answers to the West Mesa mystery may have been buried with them. And then there's the unsettling idea that the killer simply moved on. Could they have relocated to another city, starting anew with a fresh slate of victims? Or did they alter their methods, no longer leaving behind the same kind of evidence? Serial killers are known for adapting to circumstances, and it's possible that the West Mesa was just one chapter in a longer, darker story. The timing of the murders and their abrupt cessation is one of the case's most confounding aspects. It's a gap in the narrative that investigators have struggled to fill, and it leaves the haunting possibility that the killer isn't finished, they've just been waiting. For the families of the West Mesa victims, the discovery of their loved ones remains brought devastating confirmation of what they had long feared. Yet, even in their grief, they refuse to let their daughters, sisters, and mothers become mere statistics. Advocacy became their way of honoring the victims and keeping their memories alive, ensuring they were not forgotten amid the unsolved mystery of their deaths. The victims' families, along with local activists, began organizing vigils and memorials at the site where the graves were discovered. These gatherings weren't just for mourning, they were a call for action, demanding that law enforcement continue to prioritize the case. The families wanted the world to know who these women were, to remember their names, their stories, and the lives they lived before they were tragically cut short. One of the most significant efforts came in the form of a permanent memorial. The West Mesa Memorial Park stands as a testament to the lives lost, with the names of the victims etched into stone. It serves as both a place of reflection and a reminder to the community that these women mattered, that their stories are far from over. Advocates also worked tirelessly to bring attention to the case through the media. By sharing the victims' stories and highlighting the ongoing mystery, they kept the West Mesa murders in the public eye, refusing to let it fade into obscurity as an unsolved cold case. Documentaries, news reports, and even podcasts have helped amplify their voices, ensuring the victims are remembered not just for how they died, but for who they were. These efforts have not been without challenges. Many of the women led lives that society often stigmatizes struggles with addiction, involvement in sex work, or living on the margins. But their families and advocates pushed back against this narrative, emphasizing their humanity and their worth. They were daughters who loved their families, mothers who cared for their children, and friends who made people laugh. Their struggles did not define them, their lives did. This advocacy has also brought about broader discussions around protecting vulnerable women in Albuquerque and beyond. Local organizations have used the West Mesa murders as a rallying point to raise awareness about the dangers faced by women in high-risk situations and to advocate for better resources, from addiction treatment to housing programs. By refusing to let the victims be forgotten, these efforts have kept the case alive in the hearts of the community and the minds of investigators. They serve as a powerful reminder. While the killer remains unknown, the lives lost on the West Mesa will not disappear into the shadows. Their names are spoken, their stories are shared, and their memories endure. And as long as that continues, there is still hope that justice will one day be served. From the moment the first bones were unearthed on the West Mesa, law enforcement faced an uphill battle. The site was vast, and the evidence was limited. Years of exposure to the elements had erased most forensic clues. Investigators were left with skeletal remains, devoid of the personal items, clothing, or DNA that might have provided leads. It was as if the killer had vanished into the desert wind, leaving behind only questions. Compounding the lack of physical evidence was the difficulty of tracing the victims' final movements. Many of the women lived transient lifestyles, making it hard to establish reliable timelines or pinpoint when and where they had been taken. Witnesses, too, were scarce. Those who might have seen or known something were often unwilling to come forward, either out of fear of retaliation or mistrust of law enforcement. Budgetary constraints added another layer of complexity. Cold cases like this one require immense resources, manpower, advanced technology, and the ability to chase leads wherever they might go. But as the years passed, public attention waned, and the case slipped down the list of priorities. For the investigators who remained committed to solving the murders, these obstacles were a constant source of frustration. Despite their best efforts, progress was slow, and each dead end deepened the sense of helplessness surrounding the case. The West Mesa became a haunting reminder of the limits of justice when faced with the perfect storm of a cunning killer and insurmountable challenges. In cases like the West Mesa murders, DNA can be a game changer, or at least that was the hope. Forensic experts scoured the remains for any trace of the killer's DNA, but the results were disappointing. The bodies had been buried for years, exposed to harsh desert conditions that degraded biological evidence, leaving investigators with little to work with. Still, there was some hope. Tiny bone fragments were analyzed for potential matches, but they yielded no definitive leads. Even when DNA was recovered from the victims themselves, it pointed only to family members, not to the person responsible for their deaths. The killer's identity remained elusive. The challenge wasn't just about degraded evidence, it was also about timing. DNA technology in the early 2000s was far less advanced than it is today. Many of the tests performed at the time might have missed connections that modern techniques could uncover. For example, advances in familial DNA searches, where relatives of a perpetrator might be identified, have solved other cold cases. Could it be the breakthrough this case needs? As new technologies emerge, hope persists that the West Mesa murders might one day be solved through science. The possibility of reconstructing degraded DNA or discovering overlooked evidence in old samples keeps investigators and the families of the victims clinging to the belief that answers are still within reach. The West Mesa murders have fueled two dominant theories about the killer's identity. Was this the work of a lone predator, or could an organized group be responsible? Both scenarios hold chilling implications, and each presents evidence that leaves room for speculation. The lone wolf theory paints a picture of a single, calculating individual, a serial killer who targeted vulnerable women and used the West Mesa as their personal dumping ground. The deliberate spacing of the graves, the consistency in the victims' profiles, and the apparent cessation of murders after 2005 suggest a solitary figure with a methodical approach. This person would have had to operate with precision, likely luring the victims under false pretenses, disposing of their remains, and covering their tracks over several years. But then there's the theory of an organized network, a darker, more complex possibility. Some believe the West Mesa murders could be connected to Albuquerque's underground sex trafficking industry. In this scenario, the women may have been trafficked, exploited, and ultimately disposed of when they were no longer of value. Multiple perpetrators could have been involved, operating within a web of secrecy that shielded them from detection. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Could a single killer have operated within these dangerous networks, using the chaos of trafficking to mask their crimes? Or did the trafficking world unwittingly create the circumstances that allowed a predator to strike repeatedly? Both theories leave haunting questions. If this was the work of a lone killer, why have they never been identified? If it was a network, how many people knew and stayed silent? The answers remain as elusive as the killer themselves, leaving investigators and the public to weigh the evidence and wonder which theory holds the key to solving the mystery of the West Mesa. The West Mesa murders remain a perplexing puzzle, but subtle clues from the scene provide a glimpse into the killer's methods. The burial site itself is one of the most telling aspects. The graves were meticulously spaced, each one shallow but precise, suggesting a methodical and organized killer who likely returned to the same spot multiple times. This wasn't a rushed job, it was someone who took their time. The lack of personal belongings among the remains was another clue. No clothing, jewelry, or personal effects were found, as if the killer had deliberately stripped the victims of anything that could connect them to their lives. This points to a calculated effort to erase not just their identities, but also any traceable evidence. Investigators speculated about the tools used. The consistency in the depth and shape of the graves suggested the use of specific digging equipment. Did the killer work in construction, landscaping, or a similar field where they had access to such tools? Or was this someone with enough experience to dig graves efficiently under cover of darkness without drawing attention? Another subtle but significant detail was the timeline. The spacing of the murders and burials indicated a chilling pattern of consistency, as though the killer operated on a schedule. Did this pattern align with someone's work, travel, or other routines? These questions linger, tantalizingly close to answers, but always just out of reach. The clues, though sparse, paint a picture of someone meticulous, patient, and disturbingly effective. But as the years passed, the trail went cold. For the families of the victims, the passing years have been marked by a painful silence. Each day without answers feels like a wound reopening, a reminder that justice has yet to be served. The emotional toll is immense, as they're left with the constant question: why? For law enforcement, the West Mesa murders became a haunting cold case, a grim reminder of the limits of even the most determined investigation. The lack of new leads, coupled with the overwhelming challenges of the desert site, created a sense of frustration and defeat. Many investigators who worked the case have since retired, passing the unsolved mystery to a new generation of officers. The community, too, has been deeply affected. The knowledge that a killer operated undetected for years, targeting some of the city's most vulnerable women, left an indelible scar. The sense of fear has faded over time, but the questions remain. Is the killer still out there? Could they strike again? Some believe the case may never be solved. The evidence, degraded by time and the elements, may never yield the answers investigators need. The killer's identity, shrouded in the secrecy of the desert, might remain hidden forever. But even in the face of uncertainty, hope persists. Advances in cold case technology have breathed new life into investigations once thought unsolvable. Techniques like familial DNA analysis, which connects suspects through relatives, and advanced forensic genealogy have cracked cases that remain dormant for decades. For example, the infamous Golden State Killer was identified more than 40 years after his crimes thanks to forensic genealogy. Cases involving degraded or incomplete DNA have also seen breakthroughs as technology evolves to work with smaller samples and older evidence. Could the same advancements bring justice to the victims of the West Mesa? Investigators have expressed optimism that as technology progresses, previously unusable evidence could finally provide a lead. New tools, combined with renewed public interest in cold cases, keep the possibility of resolution alive. For the families of the victims, these breakthroughs offer a glimmer of hope. The belief that one day the name of the person who took their loved ones might finally be spoken, and that justice might finally be served keeps them fighting for answers. As we reflect on the West Mesa murders, we are left with a haunting collection of facts and unanswered questions. 11 women, each with a life and a story, were taken too soon. A desolate stretch of desert became their final resting place, and their killer remains a phantom, eluding justice. We've explored the clues, the suspects, and the theories. Was this the work of a single, calculating predator, or did an organized network play a role? Did the killers stop because they were caught for another crime, or are they still out there, living among us, their dark secret buried deeper than the graves on the West Mesa? Now it's your turn to weigh the evidence. Who do you think the killer was? What theory makes the most sense to you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes a fresh perspective can spark the breakthrough no one saw coming. The truth is still out there, waiting to be unearthed. The question remains, will the West Mesa ever give up its final secret? Or has the silence of the desert already served as the killer's final alibi?